T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have...
From its first flight in 1981 till its final landing in 2011, the Space Shuttle was the backbone of the American space program. Built upon the experience gained from Apollo, and with the goal of making a reusable spacecraft, NASA accomplished a feat that most thought was impossible. 5 complete shuttle systems were built and completed 135 missions to low Earth orbit. They conducted science experiments, deployed and fixed the Hubble Space Telescope, and helped to build the International Space Station, which is in healthy operation still. Using Kerbal Space Program, we'll take a deep dive into each mission, looking at the crew, payload, and mission objectives. Join us on this walk through history. And hey, you just might learn something. I'm Sears JT, and this is Project STS. STS-9, Space Shuttle Columbia. Columbia comes back into service after taking a little bit of a break, letting Challenger do a lot of the work. But Columbia is back with STS-9. It launched on November 28th. Sorry, I can't talk. In 1983, 4 p.m. UTC or 11 a.m. Eastern, so we're back to day launches. As opposed to the night launch on STS-8. It is 3 months after STS-8. So even though Challenger took a lot of the load up front, because we had a 60-day turnaround between 7 and 8, that was the same orbiter. Columbia took a little bit of a break, because if I remember correctly, 5, 6, 7, and 8 were all Challenger. So in that time that Challenger was flying those missions, they brought Columbia back to the shuttle processing facility and gave it a bunch of upgrades. What do those upgrades include? Well, a lot of it was in prep for the payload, which you kind of see here, which we'll get into once we're up in orbit. But along with those upgrades for the payload, there's a lot of avionics upgrades, and also upgrading the SSMEs. So the SSMEs, not testing is the wrong way to put it, but during operational missions from 1 to now we're at 8, or 9, through 8, they made a bunch of upgrades to the SSMEs, which now they're rated for 104% maximum thrust. So that extra 4% could get you into a higher orbit, theoretically. So they swapped out all the SSMEs on Columbia and gave them the upgraded SSMEs for the 104%. Which then they took the old SSMEs, refurbished them to then put on Atlantis, which once we do the first mission for Space Shuttle Atlantis, we'll talk about those engines. But they got the same upgrades that the new engines on STS-9's Columbia got, but they were just refurbished. Other than that, I said it launched on November 28th. It was originally scheduled for October 29th, so a full month prior, but they found an issue with the right SRB's exhaust nozzle, so this SRB down here, down in the lower right. They found a problem with the exhaust. So it was the first time that a shuttle stack was rolled back from the pad back to the VAB, which then they destacked it, put the shuttle back in the orbital processing facility until they figured out what was wrong with the right-handed SRB. And then once they figured it out and everything, they replaced the exhaust nozzle on the SRB and they rolled it back out. This is STS-9, right? You think the next logical mission is STS-10, which was scheduled. STS-10 was on the schedule, but had to be canceled due to payload issues, which I didn't look up what those payload issues were. I can only assume they were satellite production problems that didn't make STS-10 happen. So then after STS-9, they switched to a different numbering system. So the mission after STS-9 is STS-41A, which and then it gets really interesting, because then we go to STS-41, STS-51, and then I think it reverts back to the regular numbering system after Challenger happened with STS-26, I believe. And once we get to STS-26 and 51, or the mission that happens before 51L, which was 51L is Challenger. Once we get to the mission before 51L and then STS-26, we'll kind of go into that a little bit more. Last thing I'll say about STS-9 is that before we talk about the crew, which this kind of leads into talking about the crew, it's the first non-US citizen to fly on a space shuttle during this mission. It was the crew member I'm talking about was a West German citizen, which he's not the first German to go into space, but he is the first non-US citizen to fly on a US spacecraft. So, commander of this mission, it's the infamous John Young, which we'll talk about him during Ascent, but if you don't know who John Young is, he is the Jebediah Kerman of... Or not Kerbediah. Jebediah. I don't know why I say Kerbediah. He's the Jebediah Kerman of Human Space Program, John Young. This will be his last time into space. So it's kind of a somber mission in that case. His pilot is Brewster H. Shaw, Owen K. Garriott, and Irf Merbold riding in the... Wait. Oh, I put him in the wrong seat. Brewster, get in there. And then Parker and Lichtenberg riding in the middeck. Again, I don't know how these guys rode in the middeck. I would really not want to ride the middeck. You have no windows. You have no idea what's happening. All you have is the radio in your headset. I don't know how those guys did it, man. But you have John Young at the stick, more or less, with Brewster. So you're in good hands for sure. All right. So with the crew in the shuttle, I think we're ready to roll this thing out to the pad and get her going. And close up the payload bay and roll STS-9 out to the pad. So while this is rolling out to the pad, it was originally scheduled for October 29th, so a full month before it was supposed to launch. And I talked about the right SRB's exhaust problem. They rolled the stack back for the first time, restacked it with the new SRB, rolled it back out. That whole process took a month. Which I guess if you're gonna get rid of an SRB and replace it, that makes sense. So with this thing on the pad, it launched at 11 a.m. Eastern, so let's time warp to a daytime launch. A nice lunchtime launch. Oh, we had a slight eclipse there with the moon. That was kind of sick. Okay. STS on. Launch of STS-9 Space Shuttle Columbia in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. Liftoff of Space Shuttle Columbia. Go for roll. So in putting the crew in this mission, it's the first space shuttle for six people. It's adding that one extra person. Let's reset. And it's the first to have quote-unquote NASA astronauts. Because I didn't mention it when we were putting the crew in the shuttle, but there are... So we got Commander John Young, which... If you guys don't know John Young, go look him up. And pilot Brewster Shaw. That's all pretty standard for a space shuttle mission. And then 2 mission specialists, Owen and Robert. But also has 2 payload specialists for the first time, Ulf and Byron. So usually in the past couple STS missions, we have a mission specialist, but no payload specialist. But since we're launching Spacelab for the first time, they decided to launch some people who are super familiar with the payload and not necessarily with the shuttle itself. Another kind of first for this is the first time that 2 pre-shuttle astronauts fly in the same mission. John Young and who was it? John Young and Parker. Sorry, I should have written that down. But John Young and Parker being the 2 pre-shuttle astronauts to fly in this mission. On the missions before, they didn't have any pre-shuttle veterans fly together. So with that being said, like I said, Commander John Young, he was also commander of STS-1. He's commander of this one as well. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention to my Apple apps, so I may have screwed it up slightly. Go for OMS's ignition. OMS ignition confirm. Go for ET set. ET set confirm. The pilot, Brewster H. Shaw. This is his first space flight. I wrote down a note that he was actually in a band in college, since I was also in a band in high school, called The Gentleman. Kind of a fun name. After graduating college, he went into the Air Force, flying F-100s. And he actually did a bunch of F-100 training out here at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. So I'm already a fan of Brewster already, because he trained out here at Luke Air Force Base. After training at Luke Air Force, he did a bunch of stuff at Edwards, and then eventually getting selected into the astronaut program. They call it on loan from the Air Force into the astronaut program. I'm not quite sure what that means for Brewster, but so the NASA kind of snatched him up to fly in the shuttle. And then he would also go on to fly on STS-61 and STS-28. After this space flight, of course. Next we have Owen Garriott, which this guy's done a bunch of stuff with NASA before his unfortunate passing just recently. He was an electronics officer. He did a bunch of ionosphere studies on how the ionosphere affected electronics in space. He's part of Group 4, which is one of the earlier groups for space shuttle astronauts. And this is actually his second space flight. He was actually on Skylab 3. And he was, at the time, recorded the most time in space at 60 days, which just recently we know that record has been crushed numerous times. And the only other things, he played a prank on Houston during this mission. He did a voice recording of his wife, like while he was still on the ground, and he was like a radio guy, right? Electronics, radio, that kind of thing. So he played that transmission back to Houston, and Houston thought that there was a stowaway on this mission, like of a woman. Because he was like, we're listening to this transmission of a woman on this mission. They totally freaked out, and he's like, no, it's fine. I just played a prank on you guys. So after Brewster, or not Brewster, we got Owen, and then after Owen, we got Robert Parker, one of the veteran astronauts. He was in the same group as Garriott, so astronaut group 4. Is, as I mentioned last mission, astronaut group 8 is the one that we're going to get a lot of shuttle astronauts from. So this guy's from astronaut group 4. It's one of the earlier ones. He was actually Capcom on Apollo 17 when Gene Cernan spoke the last words of a man standing on the surface of the moon. Which, hopefully in a couple of years, that won't be the thing anymore, but Robert Parker was Capcom when Gene Cernan spoke his last words on the surface of the moon. So after that, he would also serve as program scientist for Skylab and fly an STS-35 after this mission. Again, hopefully he loses that distinction. That he doesn't hear the last words from a man spoken on the surface of the moon. After Parker, I'm going to skip Ulf and go to Byron. We'll come back to Ulf. Byron Lichtenberg. Definitely interesting last name. He was just a researcher at MIT for experiments used on Spacelab and to assess human-computer workstations for the space station after this mission. He was an Air Force pilot, flew an F-4, F-100, and an A-10, the bird machine. And he was the first astronaut to serve as a payload specialist on this mission. And then, last but not least, is Ulf Merbold. He is an ESA astronaut. He is the West German first non-US citizen to fly in a space shuttle. He was part of a team of 3 selected to work on Spacelab, and then he was the one selected out of that team of 3 to go to space. We're T-minus 10 seconds for orbital insertion burn. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Mark. The ESA astronaut. He'd also go to fly on STS-42. Euromir, which I actually don't know what Euromir is, and he would actually fly in a Soyuz rocket. The support crew for this, which again, I will mention like I have been the past couple missions, all of these people except one that I'm about to mention would go in to fly on later shuttles. That one being Chuck Lewis. He was a Capcom at Marshall that would not fly on a shuttle, but the rest of these names: Jonny Blaha, Franklin Chang Diaz, Mary Cleve, Anna Fisher, William Fisher, Guy Gardner, Brian O'Connor, and Wabu Ockles. Ulf got chosen over him to go on this mission. He was on the same team that Ulf was on for the Skylab research. Or not Skylab, Spacelab, sorry. So you'll notice the payload looks a little bit different, and it's attached to the front of the space shuttle. That's because this is Spacelab. This is Spacelab 1. This mission is entirely devoted to working in Spacelab, getting it to work, testing its capabilities. And that's why we have the first ESA astronaut, because Spacelab was developed by ESA. Well, developed and funded by ESA. Spacelab is fully configurable. So on STS-9, it was a long configuration. Excuse me. But there are actually 2 modules built, 2 habitation modules built that could be in a long configuration, which this mimics, or a short configuration, which is half the size. And since there were only 2 built, they put the 2 together to make the long configuration. And it allowed astronauts to perform a lot more experiments than what they could do in the mid-deck. It gave them a little bit more room, and it gave them what they would call a shirt-sleeve environment. So essentially they don't have to wear, they're not required to wear any extra clothing inside this habitation module. Along with Spacelab, there was also a lot of other configurable components with it, which you have the pallet, they call it. It's a U-shaped platform for mounting instruments, science. Could even mount telescopes if they wanted. It had mounting points for more heavier equipment than that. And it was highly configurable. I believe they used it on... I have it written here. So yeah, a Spacelab pallet flew in STS-2 and 3. There was also a part called the Igloo, which was just a cylindrical pressurized compartment that a lot of the electronics and stuff like that, the stuff that controlled the other parts of Spacelab, could also ride in. One did not ride on this mission, but I think we'll see an Igloo Spacelab part not too far future. But they wanted a compartment that was pressurized for the electronics, so it could operate how they thought it would operate back down on Earth. So other than the Igloo, there was another part called the IPS, which was a gimbaling piece of equipment. So if you had to attach like a telescope that had to be pointed at a certain spot while the shuttle was going around the Earth, the IPS is what you wanted. You could put cameras, telescopes, whatever that needs to be pointed at one spot during the duration of a flight. The IPS would go on to fly on 3 future missions, and only 2 of the IPS modules were made, along with, obviously 2 was kind of a common number with the ESA, 2 HAB modules, 2 Igloos, 2 IPSs. But we'll probably talk about the IPSs a little bit more in future missions. I'm kind of talking about the entire Spacelab configuration as a whole. And speaking of Spacelab as a whole, it was a big Lego set. I think ESA built it as a Lego set on purpose, so they could do many different configurations based on the mission they were trying to accomplish. And it could all fit in the shuttle payload bay because obviously it was at the time, it was probably the best way to get payloads into orbit. Well, best / cheapest, I guess. I don't know what ESA had for launch capabilities during 1983 when this thing launched, but it's not surprising that they partnered with NASA to put this kind of payloads into the shuttle. We'll see pieces of this thing later. So that's why Columbia took a while to do another launch. I get that, there it is. Because they had to modify the mid deck to have this configuration to have a way to get into the payload bay that's pressurized. So that it kind of explains why we didn't see Columbia for a little while. Other than that, they did split the crew into 2 teams, so there's a crew of 6, 3 and 3. We had Young and Shaw, so pilot commander, each on separate teams. And then you split up the 2 mission specialists, and then you split up the 2 payload specialists. So there's a red team and a blue team. I'm zooming up, I'm scrolling up to see who's on what team. You had John Young, Parker, the 2 veterans, and Ulf, the guy from the ESA, on red team. And then on blue team, obviously we had Shaw, Garriott, and Lichtenberg. And the teams were split up because then they would do 12-hour shifts on and off, doing experiments and whatnot for the Spacelab. Most of the time, Young and Brewster would hang out in the flight deck, while the mission specialist and the payload specialist went into Skylab. I keep saying Skylab, into Spacelab to do experiments and whatnot for those 12 hours. Which in the 12 hours, you have your orbital period at 90 minutes. So you're doing a lot of day-night cycles. So initially, the mission was supposed to last roughly a day. They just wanted to test the Spacelab, but since everything went so flawlessly that first day, they extended an additional 10. So once this mission was done and over, it was actually the longest space shuttle mission to this point, because most of them were 5 to 6 days. But this one was pushing 11 days in orbit before it came back down. And it actually wasn't supposed to be that way because they extended the mission because everything went so well. Oh, just stay up there. You're fine. We gave you enough stuff. You can hang out in orbit for a little bit longer. So I was talking about teeters, right, during STS-8. teeters actually worked for a change. Weird. They I guess fixed a bunch of the problems. I actually forgot to put an antenna on this, but there should be a K-band antenna on this up front. But the teeter satellite was finally remedied of its problems, and it was fully functional for the entire mission, transmitting a bunch of data from STS-9 down to the ground stations without issue. So nowadays, when a rocket launches, if you heard them talk about the teeters network, and well, they had that thing with the Starliner launch where it had a delay crossing teeters satellites, kind of get what they're talking about. They're geosynchronous satellites to handle communication of a spacecraft as they go around the globe. Other than that's kind of STS-9 in a nutshell. I obviously gotta still land it, but as far as a payload mission architecture sort of point of view, they did a bunch of experiments in Spacelab while one person was in the flight deck. And yeah, Spacelab worked flawlessly, mission went flawlessly, John Young crushed it. Some interesting things happened during landing, which I won't talk about now, we'll talk about during landing. But yeah, Space Shuttle Columbia coming back from getting a bunch of upgrades for a while, performed its mission pretty good up until landing, which there's some problems during landing I'll talk about when we get to that point. But a lot of the research they got out of Spacelab, I think, paved the way for the ISS. It was like the shirt and sleeve quote unquote environment, being able to do experiments in that environment, and doing them in a successful way that gave good science, paved the way for the ISS, I think. So in a weird way, this mission was very important to building the ISS. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Alright, field up cutoff. Field up cutoff confirmed. Activate the OMSs for deorbit. So they were trying to reorient the orbiter roughly 4 hours before re-entry, which kind of matches this in a Kerbal way. One of the flight control computers crashed. Not good. They were trying to fire the RCS to reorient it, and the flight computer crashed, so they switched to the second one. The second one crashed a few minutes after that, but they were able to get that second one rebooted. Luckily, luckily. If they didn't get that second one rebooted, there's going to be problems, because they would have had to switch to a backup system, which may or may not have worked. They have no idea if that system would have worked. So Young actually delayed the landing for a little bit. Like, I think it was like a few minutes. Let's see if I wrote that down. Yeah, a few minutes later, the second crash happened. Young delayed the landing, letting the orbital drift, so no control. John Young, like the BA of the space program, is like, no, I'm just gonna let the orbiter drift. We'll figure it out. Which, so the shuttle procedure, if they lose flight control software or flight control computer use, they have to switch to a backup system that has what's called a backup flight software. I want to make sure I say this correctly. The BFS. So if they had activated the BFS early enough that the second flight computer had the same problem as the first flight computer, they would have lost full control of the orbiter for quite some time. It didn't say how much time that would have been, but if they switched to backup system, the second computer was the backup. Okay. Stop. If that backup system encountered the same problem as the primary, it would have been like, it didn't say it just had a long time to fix the problem, which would have caused a bunch of issues with trying to land and stuff like that. So there was a bunch of problems with they didn't get that computer fixed. And John Young actually testified later, while this computer failings were happening, that had we activated the backup flight software during the loss of the second flight computer system, it would have resulted in loss of vehicle and crew, because they would have lost control, and it would have caused re-entry without control of the orbiter. So the whole thing would have gone the way of probably Columbia, which is, I mean, it's not a joke, but it would have been something similar. There was something that happened just before a touchdown. There was actually a freaking fire that broke out during touchdown. Not a lot of people know this. On STS-9, a fire broke out. An actual fire, not a false alarm. We had a false alarm in STS-8. A real, actual fire broke out in the orbiter while landing STS-9. It was a hydrazine leak in the aft compartment by where the engines are. Luckily, they still had full control of the orbiter, so they landed it without issue, but an actual fire broke out on STS-9 during landing. And obviously, after it landed, it required extensive repairs. Because you want to fix that hydrazine leak for one on the SSMEs, but you gotta fix that flight control computer problem. Which Boeing's not the only one to have freaking software issues. It's not an uncommon thing. This was a certified orbital spacecraft, and it had software issues. So, hydrazine, maybe it wasn't SSMEs. Hang on. There was a hydrazine leak during landing on STS-9. So due to these issues, Columbia would not fly again until after 1985. And we're in 1983. Right, so take that into account. It did not fly until 1986. Due to the computer issues and the hydrazine leak. The OMS and RCS use hydrazine, so maybe it was an RCS leak. And an RCS link would make sense during re-entry. Wow, this thing is light. Wow. Okay. That turned really nicely. It's still sketched. We're gonna make it. We're almost prograde. I think we'll be okay. I can make it reach. It's not gonna make it? No, we're gonna make it. Oh god, nope. We're gonna be short. We're gonna be short. Yeah, you're right, Thomas. Okay, so I talked about the hydrazine leak, but there was also some power unit issues that also caused another fire. they figured those out and were not an issue, but they still kind of caught fire and they landed them. So that's why it kind of needed extensive upgrades and renovation after this mission. Other than the mission completing just fine, upon landing they found a bunch of issues, so that's STS-9. Space Shuttle Columbia. We won't see it for a little bit, but it's a freaking workhorse of the Space Shuttle program. It's become my favorite shuttle at this point, for sure.